So this makes me so happy because don't tell anyone, but Dan is my favorite chef of all time. And I get to interrogate him about a couple of things. One, his new company. Two, why food waste is an issue that he believes we can solve. And three, the growing role of chefs in sustainability. Okay, I have a couple of more shameless plugs today, so just bear with me. This will also be aired as an episode on our new podcast, Food Talk with Danny Nierenberg. I really like myself. I like saying my name, as you can tell. Our podcast is brand new, and I kind of need your help spreading the word. So the first 10 people in this audience using an iPhone that go now, subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. If you raise your hands, one of our volunteers will give you a signed copy of Nourished Planet. Our volunteers are all over the room, and if you could just raise their hands and show them your phones, you'll get a signed copy. And then for those of you watching online, if you do it and use the hashtag #FoodTank, we'll select 3 of you randomly to get the book. So I'm just gonna wait here. I have all the time in the world. You should take out your phones. Dan doesn't have to be anywhere.
No.
We'll just wait.
Yep.
Food Talk with Danny Nierenberg. Okay, this is great.
Hello.
It's happening.
Yeah.
The volunteers are on top of it. All right, then we can get going. That didn't take long at all. So Dan is one of those people who really needs no introduction, but I have to try. So you're a James Beard award-winning chef. You co-own Blue Hill Restaurant with your awesome brother, David, right? Yep. You're also the founder of Row 7, a seed company we'll talk about in a minute. He is an author, an activist. He wrote the book, The Third Table. He's an amazing thinker and doer, farmer, breeder, an all-around good guy. You've just been a good friend to me in Food Tank, and I couldn't be happier to have you here.
Thank you.
So thank you. So people know that you're a chef and an author, but I don't think people understand that you've been working on breeding for a long time. You worked with Stephen Jones, right, at the Bread Lab to develop the Barber wheat variety, and now you've started this company, Row 7. Can you just give everyone sort of an idea of what this company is about and why you decided to start it?
Yeah, I mean, it was accident. I mean, there was no conscious plan here, and you say you ascribed to me a few things that I don't know that I would. I mean, I'm happy to be called a farmer and an activist and all that, but farmer maybe stretches it a little bit. I don't know. Yeah, but okay, we can talk about that. But in terms of the breeder, I don't want to, I bred this wheat called Barber wheat. So people say, oh, Dan's both a chef and a breeder. I actually put these 2 plants together like this, and that was it. And then it just ended up, it was like Casino in the Sky. It became this amazing wheat. And it was really, yeah, I failed 7th grade biology. So I'm telling you that I had nothing, it absolutely nothing to do with this. It was the expertise of breeders like Steve Jones that have guided me through this whole thing. But it started with this conversation that I had with this guy named Michael Mazurek, who you know is an incredible breeder at Cornell University. Michael came to dinner at Blue Hill, and I was just struck by having a conversation with the table. I came out from the kitchen, which I rarely do, but the captain was talking about this guy who was at the table, was like speaking like a chef, and it was just sort of interesting what he was saying. So I went out, met him, and I invited him back to the kitchen. And it was really late at night, and we were standing there in the kitchen, and one of my cooks was like preparing a butternut squash for the next day, like sort of, peeling it or whatever. And Michael, being a squash breeder from Cornell, I sort of just played around with him and said, if you're such a great breeder, why don't you breed a squash that actually tastes good? And he got super serious and looked at me and said, in all my years of breeding, no one has ever asked me to select for flavor. That's crazy. It's crazy. And that's when that was like a light bulb moment. I mean, even at the moment, I felt like this is good. There's going to be a before and after this conversation, because how is it possible that breeders, who are the architects really for our food system, they create the blueprints, and here's a genius really who is motivated by flavor and apparently has the tools to create deliciousness. And yet, as a chef, which is the thing I do all day, try and create deliciousness, I'm not talking to this guy. And so that launched a conversation that has endured, and he actually co-founded the company with me
Right.
because we had some success with a squash called Honey Nut, which was based on that conversation, a butternut squash that, based on my challenge, he shrunk and made into a squash that. Has anyone ever heard of the honey nut squash? I mean, yes, it's you will hear about it. I say that proudly as the father of a budding adolescent squash that is making its way around the country. No, but it's amazing. It's in these past. So that conversation happened 9-10 years ago this fall.
Oh, wow.
And that seed was at 0, and now today it's in Whole Foods and Trader Joe's around the country. I just got word that Blue Apron harvested 2.4 million pounds of honey nut squash.
That's crazy.
Based on a conversation in the kitchen of like, no one's ever asked me to select for flavor, and here was a conversation that gave the confidence to the breeder that there was somebody who was going to advocate and promote deliciousness. Well, that's easy. That's what I do. So, and actually chefs really got behind it is what happened. It wasn't just me. I just introduced them to other chefs, and like they went nuts. Chefs always go nuts for flavor because it just makes us look like better chefs. It's a total self-interest. And like a squash that you don't have to like heroically add, honey and maple syrup and caramelize whatever sugars are there and do all these backflips to make it actually taste good is a squash that you want to promote. And so that's what ended up happening. Chefs just ran with it, and now today it's selling like hotcakes.
I love it. But let's go back a step. Why weren't they breeding for flavor? Like, explain why flavor has sort of been bred out.
Yeah, in the case of squash specifically, a butternut squash is this. That's the workaday squash. I mean, that's 80% of the squash market is butternut squash. 85%. I mean, all of you like pumpkin purees you get Thanksgiving. It's not pumpkin, it's squash. Everyone knows that. Like, it's a butternut squash. But it has been selected for lots of things, namely long distance travel, storage. It's a big one. Storage is the biggest because it's harvested in the fall, whatever climate that is, and then it's stored until you buy it at your supermarket. So it's got to have great storability. It's also bred for water, to take in water. I mean, this is, 75% water. So the honey nut squash that's this is just with a lot of water squeezed out. That's simplifying. This is the extent of my knowledge about breeding. But he selected against it. And why would a breeder breed for water? Well, because the food system is based on how much weight. So the farmer and actually it's the middleman, the distributor, and the marketplace is all making their profits based on weight. So if water is free, we could argue about whether water is free, but for this purpose, it is free. And so you breed for water, which actually explains a lot of breeding that's happened in the last 50 years. It goes to weight, and the nutrient density of what you're eating is a lot less than it could be. And the honey nut squash is an example of that because the nutrient density, one bite, one spoonful of this honey nut squash, besides the fact that it is so crazy sweet and delicious, it's sort of haunting. It like stays like actually I'm just about to say it's like a fine wine, and that is not an overstatement because you eat it and 10 minutes later you're still tasting the squash. That's like a fine Bordeaux or whatever. That's great, and that's the flavonoids. Which flavonoids are nutrition, but they're also flavor, and so they're one and the same thing. So when you select for this flavor, this is the nice correspondence. You're selecting for deliciousness. For flavor, you're selecting for nutrient density. They are actually one and the same thing, which is also something that we tend to forget. Anyway, so why chefs go back to heirlooms and old stuff is because stuff wasn't bred for water, and it wasn't bred for long distance travel, and it wasn't bred for storability and all these, and it wasn't bred for uniformity, which is a whole nother, recent phenomenon. Is seed companies are breeding vegetables and grains so that it grows well in the Hudson Valley, but it also grows well in Southern California, and in Canada and Texas, and in Mexico and China. And that's a seed, just plain to the extent that I know about breeding, that is a dumbed down seed. You are taking the genetics and taking the lowest common denominator so that it grows well and gives the yield that these agribusiness corporations depend on, and flavor is not a determining factor. In fact, as one breeder explained to me, if you are not selecting for flavor, you are selecting against flavor.
Sure. So row 7 seeds are bred for specific regions then?
Row 7 seeds are bred for specific regions, and they're bred with the correspondence of great flavor and great yield in the field. If it was just great flavor, we'd be an heirloom seed company.
Right.
But the problem with heirlooms, as we all know, is that the yield on heirlooms is quite low. And agronomically, they're just like a risky seed to grow. Like farmers don't love to grow them unless they have people like us who are willing to pay extra and will guarantee that there's a market for an heirloom carrot or an heirloom wheat or a heritage breed, whatever. But that's not, while those genetics are important to preserve, that's not a way to change the food system, because actually it's the 1%, what it is. It's quite elitist. And I am an elitist because of who I cook for, of course, but also because of what I advocate for. Is I used to advocate. I used to proselytize for old stuff.
But you're selling these seeds on the internet and at Walmart, right? So it's not just for fancy rich people.
No, that's my point. Is that this idea that there's a choice, there's false choice between flavor, nutrient density, and yield. It's crazy. It's not true. We're proving that just with our seeds, that you can actually breed. Well, the honey nut squash is back to that, my bravura squash. It's like that thing has about 15 to 20% less yield than a butternut. Now, 15 to 20% is a lot. If like, the Walmarts of the world were sitting on the stage, they'd be laughing and say 20% of how you can't, the margins on this stuff is 2%, so 20% is huge. But we didn't put any money into this. Like this was a weekend project. And what if, as the last time I was on stage was with a Monsanto executive, and he turned to the crowd and said, we spend $1 million a day on corn research. $1 million a day? A day? Like, give me $100 for the squash, and we'll get the yield. In fact, we just released, Michael just came up with the 2.0 version of the honey nut. So it's the next version. So now you can go and buy it's still an experimental. Different? It's called 898. What's different? The yield is 30% higher. Oh gosh. Still lower than your tasteless squash, but it's getting there. Yeah. It's organically bred, and it has a storage life that's 3 months longer than the honey nut.
Nice.
So in 2 years, the honey, it's like sort of like the iPhone introduction. Like you'll look back at the honey nut and be like, oh, that was old. And that's what we should be doing. We should not take old seeds and wrap them and hug them and say, nobody screw with my seed because my grandmother always cooked this. That's crazy. We should take these seeds and continually update them for regions, as you said, which is so important because our regions in the United States especially are so different. Soil conditions and rainfall and temperature, they're so different, and we need to breed a squash that thrives here and in Southern California, and those seeds are very different. And we also need to understand that with work and money and time and curation, we can continue to improve, and we should be, and not be scared of that. I tend to be like most people, which is nostalgia, rooted in nostalgia, and that's just, at its root, it really is an elitist endeavor.
Right, but you brought up an important point that this 2.0 version can be stored longer.
Yeah, that's a big one.
So you're not giving up sort of shelf life, the things we're talking about at this conference.
That's why I say it's a false choice.
Yeah.
And if Michael were sitting here, and he should be advocating for, as he really developed this, it's like, I'm never asked. And so that's what we're doing, is we're going to all these breeders and saying, what are you throwing away? And that's where it gets to the sort of waste idea too. It's like, what are the things that you're excited about that nobody's asking for? And it's amazing when you get the responses you get. It's just like, I just got off the phone, so I'm thinking about this oat breeder I was just talking to yesterday. That's an amazing guy in North Dakota. And he sent me these, this is the question I said, so what are you throwing away? Always do that. And he sent me what he had in his desk drawer. He said, I'm just in love with this oat, and he sent it to me, and I cooked it. I cooked it with water. I didn't put anything on. I put it with water, and me and my sous chefs were sitting there cooking. We started laughing. It was like, you've never tasted oats before. Oh. I could not believe it. So I called him right there on the phone. I was like, what the hell is this? And he's like, oh, that's an oat that I developed in the early 70s, but nobody will buy it anymore. I was like, what? The yield's bad? What's the thing? He's like, no, the yield's actually really good. It's the American Heart Association requires a stamp on oatmeal with low fat content. They won't put a stamp on unless it has low fat content. Well, the oats that you're eating has very high beta glucans, which have high fat content. Now, what's been discovered over the last 10 years is beta glucans may be one of the most healthy things you can eat for heart health and for free radical, whatever I'm not a doctor, but you read about beta glucans, and you're like, it's the miracle. And yet we've been breeding against beta-glucans because American Heart Association has been saying they want to stamp. It's just like this kind of thing. It's just,
Yeah.
So we're going to try and push this like new oat that would just make you weep when you taste these oats. It's like you'll never want to go back.
I just have to give an aside here. I love watching Dan Barber talk because he's so animated. You're so into it.
If you tasted the oats, you'd feel the same.
It's like so great. So you've brought up this point about that recipes start with the seed, but most chefs don't feel that way. And you've been a leader at sort of convincing chefs, whether it's about your pop-up wasted to really educate people about reclaiming food and reusing food that would otherwise be wasted.
I don't know about that. I would love to take credit for something that I'm the only chef that does it, but I think chefs are actually like totally invested in this. They just, like me, didn't know that they could talk to a breeder.
Yeah.
So what's our investment? Our investment isn't old. It's in heirlooms, it's in heritage, because we look back because that's where the flavor is. And so I was that guy too.
Yeah.
I happened to have a very lucky conversation with somebody who explained this to me in stark terms, and then I could taste it, and I was off and running. And so are a lot of chefs now. I'm not the only one. But I think it was more dumb luck than it was, because if you go back 5 years, all I was talking about was heirlooms.
Yeah.
We opened stone barns with this repository for all these old stuff. We're growing everything old. But then you look at the yields in comparison, you're like, well, does this actually bleed into the culture? No, it stays in a tight-knit circle with a white tablecloth restaurant. And the idea that the cathedral of my white tablecloth restaurant is the only place where you can experience beta-glucan, jaw-droppingly delicious oats is crazy. It is crazy. And part of the reason we started the company was to democratize the seed. Because there is not a false choice between high yield and deliciousness and nutrient density. There actually can be one and the same thing.
Absolutely.
That's for the future. I just wanted to say one thing, because I know we're at a food waste conversation. I don't want
No.
Because one thing that goes in line with this, another conversation I had not that long ago with a broccoli breeder, a brilliant broccoli breeder in the Pacific Northwest, Jim Myers, and he was talking about, here we are with, he was actually at a farm where there was 300 acres of broccoli, and I sent you this picture. We're like, if you just take it, no, it's okay, you can't start, so I'm going to describe it now to you. Like, if everyone close their eyes, they're picturing 300 acres of broccoli, which is like, mid-sized sort of just agribusiness vegetable company that's harvesting broccoli. And Foxy, that kind of brand. Okay, so there's the workers in the field, they're taking out the floret. Oh, here we are. They're taking out the floret right here, whoop, and they're leaving that, and they're running on, and now it's 200 acres of that. And what's left behind is that. Can everyone see this? Look at this. That's what's left behind. At the end of the 300 acres of harvesting the floret, you look at a field of that, and you're like, wow, that's food waste, isn't it?
Yeah.
So at the restaurant, and I'm not the only chef doing it, we're figuring out how do you cook with the stalks, and how do you cook with the leaves, and can you do backflips to make this stuff taste good? And what Jim Myers said to me, the broccoli breeders, why don't I just breed for you to eat the whole plant? Like, by that,
It's like
yeah.
common sense.
So that,
I love
yeah.
it, yeah.
So that's what we're doing. So we just had, we're just in the middle of these trials for taking the energy away from the floret. So what's going to end up happening is you're going to have less of a fruit of the broccoli, for sure. So you're going to have to get used to eating smaller broccoli, but the leaves are going to be tender and delicious, and the stalks are going to be sweet like sugar. And the reason I'm saying that so confidently and even arrogantly is because what's broccoli, Rob? Like, it's been done before.
Yeah.
So the idea that we're actually reinventing them is crazy too, because we decided in the last only 100 years that as our food system matured and we were feeding more and more people, that we could say, okay, we'll leave the rest of this because we're so productive, and we'll select just for this very delicious and nutrient-dense floret, and leave the rest because we don't need it. But what if we reversed that and started to think about the nutrition that I'm looking at here, and also the deliciousness? The broccoli leaves are stunningly delicious, as we know from Broccoli Rob. So a lot of that is just asking the question, and the breeders said, when I said, how could you start breeding for this? He looked at me and said, Broccoli Rob. Right? It's that easy. Anyway.
Common sense.
Yeah.
So I want to give the audience a few minutes to ask questions. Many of you have probably seen me moderate. I don't really tolerate long questions. So you have 30 seconds.
You very much tolerate long answers.
I do, but you're Dan Barber.
Thanks, Bill.
You have 30 seconds to state your name, your organization, and then ask a question that ends in a question mark, please, because I'm interested in hearing from all of you, but Dan has very limited time, so I want to make sure that a bunch of questions get answered. Over here, if we can start over here first.
Hello.
Hi, good morning. Christine Dimick, author, Detox Your Home. Question.
Detox your home, yeah.
Detox Your Home. What are your thoughts on GMOs?
Like, it doesn't make me hungry. If a company could produce a genetically modified seed that was really delicious, I'd start to have a conversation about it. But they don't. And all the other issues, are confusing and complex. I don't love the idea that corporations own genetics. Like, the idea that you can own biological life seems really strange to me. And but it's where we're headed. So what I think about it is, like, do I think it's as scary and is going to overtake the world? No, I just don't. And that's already being proved. Actually, in many ways, genetic modification is old news. It's dying of its own too much. That's a quote from Wendell Berry, not from me. It's too smart.
Who else? Let's try to get to the other side of the room. Yes, your hand's raised. That gentleman raised his hand, yeah.
How's it going? I'm wondering if, when it comes to designing seeds for a target yield for specific regions of the world or for the U.S., does the unpredictability of climate change and changing weather patterns affect the way that you need to think about how long your seeds will last and what kind of yield they'll actually produce?
Yeah, well, your question is actually sort of determines the answer of why we're doing what we're doing, is because as climate becomes more unpredictable, the idea that you can plant 95 million acres of corn and soybean rotations becomes less and less logical, because the weather has to be conducive to grow corn and soybeans for this all to work, and it has been. We've really had steady weather patterns since the 1940s, pretty much, but historically we haven't, and we're clearly headed into a different time. And that's why regional adaptability of seeds is so key. So actually what your question is, why we're breeding for different, there's the climate issue, which is huge, but there's also just the cultural issue. Like, why should a carrot, or let's say a squash, taste the same in the Hudson Valley as it tastes the same in Southern California or Canada or wherever? Like, that was never been that way. That's only the last 50 years. So I'm both interested in the environmental concerns of this, because I think if you do breed for regional adaptability, you stand a very good chance of a better crop and better yield for the farmer. It actually goes to serve the farmers. That's part of the blueprint idea. But then the cultural part of it is, like, what expression of the place, is hand in hand with the chef or the home cook that becomes, a regional cuisine, a regional food system, a regional expression of the weather and the soil and the climate. And to me, that's a very exciting future. But in a world where 3 companies own almost 90% of our seeds, there are 3 companies that now develop seeds for almost 90% of the future of food. 3 companies. I mean, we freak out when, like, too big to fail stuff with financials. So just think about that. 3 companies. And the reason for that is because the costs of producing seeds, of R&Ding seeds, is so enormous that these companies have moved in, and they are doing it so cheaply because they are growing it in weather conditions that I explained are so radically different. And so what we're trying to do is flip that entire paradigm on its head. And the reason that I feel confident that it stands a chance is because eaters like you and me, and everyone in this room, I bet, don't want to go to Southern California and Canada and Mexico and New York and have the same carrot. That's not why we're going out to eat. That's not why we're cooking. We want to have something that is expressive and particular to place. And that's where I think you need to start with the seeds, not just the farmer.
Probably maybe 2 more questions. Keep them short, please. Let's try to get in the middle of the room.
Thanks. Hey, Chef.
Hi.
My name's Billy Mitchell. I actually have the privilege of working with and learning from Jovan and Matthew down in Brunswick, Georgia,
Yeah.
from Strong Roots. I was wondering if you could just talk to us a little bit about your composting system from the restaurant to the farm.
You know, Jack Algier, who is the farmer for Stone Barn Center, is coming this afternoon, and you should ask that to him because he is, to me, the demigod of compost. He really understands not just how the system works, but how to create the best, most biologically active compost that feeds the soil, that feeds the plants, that gets me to look like a better chef than I am. So I encourage you to ask him this afternoon.
Awesome. You've had your hand up for a long time, so.
Hello, sir.
Hi, my name is Eric Fletcher. I'm the founder of the Food Readers Organization. We're a global initiative to promote the development of food system book clubs across the country and the world. And you talked about bleeding into the culture, and I believe that, and I think that an effective way to do that is through reading, discussing, and community organization. So I was wondering, do you have a book recommendation about touching on food waste or the topics that you have touched on so far that you could recommend for us to read as well as for our members in the Albany Food Readers Book Club chapter? Thank you.
Yeah, I like, okay, the third plate is a very... I would look,
Shameless plug.
yeah, shameless plug. I would look at I mean, I say the third plate both jokingly, but also seriously in the sense that, like, I think the issue, I have come at the issue of food waste from a systemic point of view. And when you look back at the history of cultures and cuisines, they soaked up waste quite well because they were forced into it. And so that's why I became obsessed with cuisine, because it wasn't just a roadmap to delicious flavors. It was also a roadmap to this ecological stewardship that stood the test of time. It was just unbelievable. Nobody called it waste. Nobody called a bouillabaisse wasted fish. You know, nobody called coq au vin waste food. No one called, I mean, coq au vin is a rooster that tastes like this, unless you braise it in gently in wine. Very slowly, and then it becomes an iconic French dish. Bouillabaisse was the wives of fishermen, the fishermen who couldn't sell the fish created this big soup as the fishermen were selling fish, and they came back and had bouillabaisse. That became like what it means to be French. I mean, every culture, the prosciutto di Parma is the leftover from making Parmesan cheese. The whey is fed to the pigs, and you get prosciutto di Parma. In Japan, you have a rice culture. Well, what is the rotation into rice in Japanese culture? Buckwheat. You need to put buckwheat in the ground to get a quality rice crop. So what do you do with the buckwheat? Well, in America, in organic farms, there's no market for buckwheat, so it's fed to pigs, or it's thrown away, or it's plowed under. In Japan, you create soba noodles. So another way of thinking about eating soba is, if I want to have my bowl of rice for dinner, I've got to have my soba for lunch. That's cuisine. That's putting the pieces together. I would look at books that uncover the history of these connections. And in food culture, the connections is called cuisine. I would love to continue to learn more about that, because the negotiations that peasants worked out because they were forced into it are brilliant and delicious. Yeah.
Okay, one more question, short one. Let's go back over here again, this woman right here.
Hi, I'm Erica from Harlem Grown. I was wondering, for example, with the broccoli, how does that change in pricing? And how, I think a lot nowadays with like restaurants that are trying to be low waste or are quote unquote healthier, there's a significant price increase. And so I just wanted your opinion on access to this, and how can people, let's say from low communities, take part in this experience?
Great question.
Yeah. I mean, when I was talking about democratizing the seed, I talked about it in terms of, the yield of what we are breeding for will become commensurate with the big food chain, and therefore we can compete. But looking now back at the broccoli, I mean, isn't that a democratization of the 300 acres? Because you are now yielding the entirety of what the field produced, and you're then allowing the farmer to reap profits from what you're looking at instead of throwing that into the ground. In other words, right now we are paying for that through broccoli. But what if we were able to pay the farmer for the full cost of what was present in the 300 acres, well, all of a sudden the revenue stream for the farmer increases by about 70% because 70% of a broccoli plant is the stalk and the leaves, not the floret. So if we can give a revenue stream to the farmer of 70%, all of a sudden you're harvesting and cooking with the whole farm. And that's a great equalizer, but we've got to eat it and we've got to create the market for it. So right now what chefs are doing, what I did for my wasted projects, I always cook with broccoli cores and leaves. And it's not impossible because they are delicious, but it definitely takes some craftsmanship to do and some time. And what this breeder, Jim Meyer, said to me is, well, just breed for it. And then you can start with something that is a lot easier to cook, and that's how it becomes available for the home cook. And that, to me, is the bleeding and the democratization. For the farmer makes more money, there's less waste in the field, and there's a democratization of the seed so that we all can afford to enjoy something that we should be enjoying. That's part of a cultural shift.
Fantastic point to end on. Thank you, Dan. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, guys. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.